Well, today I'm privileged to be talking to Joel Richardson. It's great to see you, Joel. Thank you for being here with us.
It's good to see you as well, Jason.
And there are many people in New Life Church enjoying your resources. But before we get into these questions, you could just share what's the best place for people to connect with you if they want to find out more or find more of your resources.
So my website is joelstrumpet.com, but I also have a YouTube channel where I post a lot of updates. But I've also been releasing all of my content on the Frontier Alliance International app. So if you go to faistudios.org, or if you type in Frontier Alliance International into any app store, you can download the app, and I'm putting out a podcast as well as the Underground, which is my video program, and we're also doing something called the Maranatha Global Bible Study, which is 2 sessions per week. We're presently working through the book of Daniel. We're going to work through the book of Revelation. We're going to work through Isaiah. We're going to make this an ongoing, again, global Bible study. So,
Yeah, I've been enjoying some of that content and it's really helpful. So thank you for that. Now, today I wanted to talk to you about in the biblical timeline, we are in the days between Passover and Pentecost. And God's used these holy days, these set apart days throughout history to tell his story. Could you just share with us, where do you see the value and the benefits of followers of Jesus understanding and getting a grasp of days like Passover, Pentecost, and even others we may not be as familiar with, like Sukkot and Tabernacles? You know, why has God set these up, and are they relevant for us as followers of Jesus to pay attention to?
yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I would just say that God, he really is a very liturgical God. He's ordained rhythm throughout life. You know, every night we go to sleep, every day we wake up. There's a rhythm to the day. There's a rhythm to the week. His week is really capped off with Sabbath, with Shabbat, and likewise, the year is punctuated by these various holy feasts, fasts, festivals, these set apart days, and they really do tell the story of redemption. As it says in the book of Revelation, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus. And in the same way, the biblical feasts, they really contain the testimony of Jesus. And so, you know, in the early church, it's painful to read, but very, very early on, as the church became dominated by the Gentiles, they really, I would say, as the conflict between church and synagogue really developed and that ruptured, you had these Gentile bishops and leaders openly saying that if Christians celebrate the biblical holidays or any of these things, then essentially they've fallen from grace. They've embraced these Jewish rituals and this type of thing, with a very narrow perspective regarding the nature of the Old Testament. I mean, borderline Gnostic type of stuff. And, you know, I would just say, look, we're not obligated to keep these things. We're not in sin, you know, if we don't, but there's tremendous blessing and benefits to doing so. Believers all over the world are waking up to the blessings of this. They're enjoying them. And, you know, look, other parts of the church get into the Christian yearly cycle, you know, with Lent and, you know, all of these type of things. And look, if that's your tradition, that's all good and fine. But the biblical holidays, the biblical seasons, they're biblical. You know, they're not man-made. And that's not to say that the things that are man-made are necessarily bad. I think there's benefit to committing to getting involved in your community's regular cycle. And again, so whether that's, you know, the Anglican cycle of, you know, Lent and all of those things, or the biblical cycle, I think it's good as a community to participate in these things. And ultimately, I would argue that the biblical holidays are, as I said, biblical. It's really not about them being Jewish or anything like that. It's about them being biblical. And again, they tell the testimony of redemption, the story of Jesus. And so it's a blessing. It's a blessing just to be part of it and to partake of the revelation that opens up when we jump into these things.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And some are more familiar to us than others. Like Passover is, often associated with Easter. We tell the story of the death and the resurrection. We sing of that. We focus on that. Pentecost, where a lot of the church is kind of familiar with it, but some people don't know there's a backstory. Before Acts 2, there's a whole history. And I know you've looked into some of these things. So if we think of Peter, James, and John, before the death and the resurrection, they're young Jewish men. They're in that culture. It's Old Testament scriptures. For them, what is Pentecost about? What's the history? If you could dig into that a little bit for us.
So first of all, obviously Passover, they're in Egypt. And both Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we kind of lump those together in a lot of ways. But they're essentially two separate set apart times, so to speak. But after they flee Egypt, you have the Exodus. They're fleeing from the Egyptians. They cross the Red Sea, and they eventually make their way to Mount Sinai. And eventually you have the single greatest theophany in all of redemptive history, in all of human history. God came down. And, I always like to point out that most of life, most of the Christian life, most of walking with God, it's really a walk of faith where the Lord asks us to live by faith, not by sight. And occasionally he opens the curtains and he does a little peekaboo. We see a miracle here or there, but oftentimes it's far and few in between. And even when we see something really crazy, we experience something really powerful, he always leaves room for doubt. He always leaves room for us to kind of second guess and go, did that really happen? Or did this miracle really take place? And the reason is, quite frankly, because he wants us to exercise our trust muscle. He wants us to practice and grow in trust. So most of life, he really does, I'll say, leave us on our own. He does little peekaboo, like when, we're playing with our kids, peekaboo.
Yeah.
And, but he, the Lord could just rip the curtains open at any given time. And we would and that's what he did at Mount Sinai. He, at this one time in history, he ripped the curtains open and he came down on the mountain. God came down in blazing fire in the thick storm clouds with a mighty earthquake shaking the whole vicinity of the mountain with a blasting of trumpets to the point where the people are at the base of the mountain. The whole mountain is consumed with fire and they're begging Moses, please tell him to stop talking. So this is the great theophany in history. And then what is the phrase that comes out of Passover? Remember. Teach these things to your children. Do not forget. And these phrases, remember, do not forget, they're embedded throughout Torah, throughout God's commandments to Israel. And this really is our mandate, is to remember. So here's the thing. From the perspective of the apostles, of Jesus, of John the Baptist, they didn't have the New Testament. They had the Old Testament. And from their perspective, the story of redemption, if you drew it like a picture, at the beginning of the story is this towering mountain, this looming mountain, Mount Sinai. And everything is pointing to that. The prophets, what are they reminding us of? What are they pointing to? They're saying, remember, don't forget. Don't forget the mighty things that God did when he led you out of Egypt. Don't forget. Or as Winnie the Pooh would say, don't forget to remember, or he forgot to remember. But, remember these things at Mount Sinai. Okay, so everything is pointing to that. So when Pentecost happens, the first episode of Pentecost, what do you have? You have the tongues of fire, right? You have the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. This is pointing directly back to the theophany. And by the way, if you look at the timeline of the Exodus, roughly 50 days or so after Passover, this would have been the time that God would have come down on the mountains. So it's this coming down on the mountain in fire. Pentecost in a lot of ways. Now, again, people will talk about Yom Teruah, the day of blasting of trumpets, as being the day that Jesus returns. You know, it's amazing, Jason, how others will point to Passover and show how there's a lot of evidence that maybe the Lord will return on Passover. You can point to Pentecost. There's embedded symbolism and imagery in all of these set aside times that actually point to the return of Jesus. Because here's the thing, from a Christian perspective, again, I'll say more of a, we as Christians tend to be much more New Testament centric. The return of Jesus is the fulfillment of what God was foreshadowing, what he was pointing to at Mount Sinai. The God, the bridegroom God who came down on Mount Sinai in blazing fire, in the storm clouds, again, blasting of trumpets with a mighty earthquake, he's coming back in the clouds, in the thick storm clouds, in blazing fire from heaven, with the blasting of trumpets, with a mighty earthquake. Jesus is the bridegroom God of Mount Sinai. And so everything begins at Sinai, and the story of redemption culminates at Mount Zion. And Pentecost, the historical Pentecost, it's a powerful time, but it also is pointing to the great day of the Lord, where you have the cosmic signs, the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. And again, this great outpouring of the Holy Spirit that will take place in the last days before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So there's just so much prophetic material wrapped up in all this imagery, and it's beautiful, it's glorious, it's wonderful to unpeel and open up, and it just continues to unfold. The revelation there, just it's really an endless well that we can continue to drink from.